A malevolent whispering static forever eroding the sanity of the Underhive. We are the unrelenting, gibbering thing of rebellion. 665.66 UHMA Chemrat Radio. Our misadventures tonight take us once again deep into the tangled rust sprawls of the Sump in search of that lost archaeotech and archive caches. Armed, as always, with what some might say is an unhealthy amount of plasma weaponry and the willingness to slag first and ask questions never, I'm your host, Goblin King. My partner in crime is the infamous treasure hunter and rogue archaeo-savant Chac, my guide to these twisting, frozen tunnels of lost history.
Hey guys, I never have anything much to say.
Welcome to episode 92 of Under the Hive of Madness, the origins of Warhammer 40k, the Chaos Gods, and Lovecraft. Since it's the season of spooky and we are covering the Horus Heresy, it feels like this is a perfect time to talk about some of the good old cosmic horror. Chac, much like me, you have a very deep background in literature in general, and while we have very much waxed philosophically on the science fiction side up to this point, we haven't really talked a lot about the horror, the grim.
No.
Of the grim. Wait a minute. I just realized both grim and dark. It's our horror comment.
You want to do that one over again?
No, it's fine. We're running with it. We haven't talked about the sci-fi, or we've talked about the sci-fi. We haven't talked about the grim dark.
So, classic horror has always been a favorite of mine, and I've been a big fan of Lovecraft and the Lovecraftian mythos, which are not the same thing, by the way, by far. For a long time, since I was a teenager, it's when I started reading it. And sort of also the horror fantasy stuff. Lovecraft actually did not write much stuff. There are not very many things that he actually wrote. However, with people like August Derleth and others, there are a bunch of other writers, they've really taken off.
The Cthulhu mythos is very much expanded post Lovecraft. And even Lovecraft borrowed and built on a couple of authors who came before him.
So the big ones that came before him, of course, were, now I don't have this here.
Robert W. Chambers is a big
Chambers,
one.
Who wrote the King in Yellow book, and who actually Lovecraft only barely mentions the King in Yellow. It's not really his thing. And then the other was Ambrose Bierce, who originally wrote Hathor, which also is something that Lovecraft doesn't really deal with. So a lot of the members of the Lovecraft mythos that people think are quintessentially Lovecraft or Lovecraftian, he didn't really have anything to do with, and barely used them in his writings. He referred to them.
He refers to the yellow sign a couple of times. Mm-hmm. He talks about Hastur. He talks about Carcosa.
Hastur is mentioned once.
He talks about a lot of the locations.
Yes.
And hints at the cosmic coincidence of those locations. But the separation between the Cthulhu mythos and Lovecraftian mythos, it's interesting because it's very much expanded, and it's expanded. I think we're in the third. I think they consider the writings now the third expansion of the Cthulhu mythos, the stuff that's coming out now. But the second expanding was the stuff that you mentioned. Delrith.
August Deller.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's the one that really took off.
He's the one who massively expanded a lot of the Cthulhu mythos right after.
Obsessive fan that ends up boiling the bunny for Lovecraft. And he took off and expanded, and a lot of his stuff sort of goes against what Lovecraft did. But the other big one, who wrote the Necroscope series of books?
Oh, crap.
So Necroscope is a book of basically... the Necroscope lets...
Brian Lumley.
Yeah, Lumley. It's a sort of a vampire series, but sort of looking the Necroscope. His main character is the Necroscope, which he can talk to the dead. That's also part Lovecraftian, and he brings in other elements from the Lovecraftian universe. And so he was a big one, but a lot of people have touched on it. There's, Sherlock Holmes and Lovecraft. There's all the stuff that was developed for the Call of Cthulhu game.
Yep. Oh yeah. None of which was developed during any portion of Lovecraft's actual life.
No.
Yeah. Fantasy gaming is a product of the 70s. Lovecraft was dead before the end of the 30s.
Yes.
And
we'll
40s.
talk later on about what I think is quintessentially Lovecraft and how I see that in 40k. And I can give you a hint right now. It doesn't have anything to do with beings from the greater beyond.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of things that cross over. There's a lot of inspiration points. There's a lot of leaping points that exist between the two. And we'll talk about it. But there is not a correlation. Cthulhu is not Nurgle, and Dagon is not Khorne. There is no, Yog-Shoggoth is not Tzeentch. There is no direct correlation between any of it. It's much more. We'll talk about cosmicism, which is the existential dread stuff that Lovecraft wrote from, and that's really kind of what chunks in. Let's jump into let's jump into 40k history really quick, or let's jump into the history of Citadel and Games Workshop really quick. So come back with us in our time machine as we go back to 1981, 1982, and kind of talk about where everything came from. So the warp is in fact mentioned in the original Rogue Trader book. In fact, there is an entire area of the book that just deals with warp creatures. And at this point, it was a lot more of an aesthetic that the writers and designers were trying to capture. They were playing with the aesthetic of what the warp looked like, of what like chaos looked like, of what chaos warriors looked like. There wasn't none of the stuff that we know of the warp and of the four gods. If you're on Patreon with us, you can see the four gods on screen right now. None of that stuff was done when the Rogue Trader book came out. The Rogue Trader book being published in 1987. However, they knew that they wanted a lot of weird things to come from the warp, and they knew that they wanted players, the DM and the players in Rogue Trader, to move really quickly and really easily between the creatures and models that existed for Rogue Trader and for, oh my God,
Fantasy
Judge Dredd and Fantasy Battle. Yeah, any of their lines, any of the lines that Citadel was producing as a model company, Games Workshop as a publishing company wanted players to be able to use, because at a certain point, they're a model. The through line that they've said for a long time, we are a model company. They're Reaper miniatures at this point in history.
Yeah.
So the model ranges that we enjoyed today, and at this point in Warhammer's history, they weren't being created specifically for what would become Warhammer 40k. The stuff that we know of is now, none of that existed. There weren't Space Marine there were Space Marine chapters.
There weren't legions.
But there were not legions, and Space Marines were not genetically modified super soldiers. They were just really, really violent, psychopathic people who came from very hard planets.
They were modified. They did have the implants and all that. By the way,
they had some of them.
They weren't explicitly men at this point. Matter of fact, they don't use those pronouns.
Anybody who came from a shitty death world could have, in their late 20s or 30s, could have a couple of surgeries to be bonded with their armor, and then there you go.
Yeah.
And it was much more that the whole idea of being captured from a planet when you were 9 years old and going through psycho indoctrination and then having like 21, I don't know why I said 17, 21 surgeries and all of this stuff. And like, maybe you'll survive, maybe you won't. And then you'll be a 12-year-old psychopathic killer. That wasn't really an idea yet.
No, and they had, like you said, they had a lot of science fiction miniatures that worked with it. They had originally like 10 chapters. So you had like Rainbow Warriors famously, and Salamanders, and Blood Angels, and Dark Angels, and pretty sure you had Ultramarines, White Scars. Everybody's like, where are all the Chaos Space Marines? Well, there weren't any.
Yeah, there weren't really Chaos Space Marines. There was.
They didn't have the whole concept of the Emperor was not a corpse on the throne. The Emperor was wounded and sitting on the throne, but he was a person. Yeah. They didn't develop that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was a little bit of talk about a civil war.
Yes,
what
there
would
was
become
a civil
the Horus
war.
Heresy. Yeah. But it was a lot more, the term renegade got used a lot more, even in the early Horus Heresy, not the early era of the Horus Heresy being 3rd edition, 4th edition, 40k. There were renegade chapters. The Red Corsairs famously were a renegade chapter. The Red Corsairs were not part of Chaos.
Yeah.
They are now. They became it throughout their involvement in the Badab Wars, but at the beginning, when the Red Corsairs as a idea was published in a White Dwarf, they were just a renegade house.
It wasn't until chapter. It was in 89, I think it was 89, 90, with the publishing of Space Marine 1 and Adeptus Titanicus, or Titan Legions, that they started to talk about the heresy, because that's what it was. At that point, in the box, you got 2 sets of Marines, and they had to fight each other. So why are they fighting each other? That's where the heresy, the first idea of the heresy, came from. And then that's when they first came up with legions. And that's when you had 4 legions that were traitors, and you had 4 legions that were look up if you can find the Space Marine 1 box. If you can't find it, I could dig it out. But you had 4 legions and 4 legions because they had to fight each other. And so you had Dark Angels, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and I don't know, maybe I don't remember who the 4th one was.
Are you going to try to find the box?
My box is not easily accessible. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So if you got the back of the box, there. Let's see. If you go down towards, you can actually see some of the different chapters.
There we go.
Yeah, that's the back of the box. On the side, they had whatever the different chapters were, and then on Chaos, you had you had Horus, and you had a couple others. So on the back, if you could see up here, you have the different legions. You have the Loyalists.
Is it the Strike Force box?
No, it's just called Space Marine, Warhammer 40k, 3D roleplay hobby game.
I think this might be, this is the same one. It's just it's the alternate cover.
Right.
It's the alternate box.
So here you have Blood Angels, Ultramarines, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, White Scars, and Salamanders versus Emperor's Children, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, Night Lords, Sons of Horus, and World Eaters.
Yeah, the original split.
Those were the original legions. And until this box came out, you didn't have legions.
Yeah, you just had chapters.
You had chapters.
And we're going through all the old heresy lore right now. Like, none of this, that the whole idea that all of this came out of the original book, and that, like, not to beat a dead horse, but the whole idea that G-Dub keeps retconning, they're not retconning. They didn't write it.
Yeah.
You can't retcon it if it didn't exist.
Yeah, it really,
they just didn't have an idea. They started off, so they had Warhammer Fantasy, and Warhammer Fantasy had dedicated models. And, in 1988, they talked about the realms of chaos. And this is the true birth of the concept of what led to the ruinous powers. And we're going to talk a little bit about Bryan Ansell, who is one of the designers and all of that here in a second. But, like, the whole idea that the legions were different in Rogue Trader or in the first edition book, first edition 40k, the book that came after Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, the whole idea that, like, they are introducing legions or they're introducing chapters ideas and it's erasing some giant portion of it, that it's not, because that stuff just not in those books.
Yeah, no, it's just, like, not there.
There is nothing there. They had this idea at this point. This all grew out of Dungeons and Dragons, and World War II miniature hobby wargaming. Mm-hmm. None of the games exist, or none of the games are played anymore. because there's newer stuff like Bolt Action and Conflict 47 and stuff that exists. But all of this stuff, all of this like militaria board and not board, but tabletop gaming, none of this is new. But then Gary Gygax released Dungeons and Dragons, and there became this whole idea that you could do all of this stuff in a fantasy setting. And then, like, what's science fiction other than fantasy, right? Like, really? But it becomes a thing, a really common thing in even modern wargaming in general, historical wargaming, is that a lot of times you have humans versus humans, because that's, well, all of the time you have humans versus humans. And because humans versus humans painted different colors was a very comfortable space to be in, it was a very easy way to expand the lines. So you take the 10 chapters that you originally had, you cut them in half, you name them legions, you set 5 against 5, and you can sell a box. Yeah. And then you have the true first edition, really, of Warhammer 40k.
Yeah. And, you know, so, right, it was, and the whole thing is like, well, why? You have to realize
this is the epic box. That's why it looks different. Yeah. This is the epic release.
Yeah, that is, I think this is second edition. But the way things that, you have to remember also that GW had a whole bunch of games going at the same time, and they were all interconnected, and they were writing lore for all of them separately.
And they were doing a lot of licensed stuff.
Yeah.
Like a lot of licensed stuff. and because those licenses expired, or because those licenses stopped producing money, but Citadel owned the rights to the models, that's how we got Lord of the Rings as a game that GW owns, Games Workshop now owns. That's how we got Arbites, which are Judge Dredd in 40k, as part of 40k. And the early Arbites models and the late 2000 AD Judge Dredd models for the game, not for the comic, but for the game, look almost exactly the same, because again, Citadel's miniature sculptors are the guys who owned the rights to that model. You know, you change the eagle from one head to 2 heads and you have an Arbite. Like it's that simple.
Yeah. And they were writing lore, you know, when things like Space Hulk came out, they had to write lore for that. And that's where you got some of the discontinued lore for on the Patreon podcast. We were talking about my Dark Angels army that I'm starting, and the lore for the Deathwing started in the Space Hulk box. And at that point, Dark Angels were Native Americans. And that story has now become apocryphal.
Yeah. Well, and one of the other things that's the way that they do stuff all the time is that, like, there were Gene Stealer orcs back in the day. The Gene Stealers could hit everything. And the way that the lore sits today is that humans are just the easiest. Humans are the easiest to make into Gene Stealers, so the Gene Stealers prefer to target humans. It's not that they can't target everything, and it's not that they haven't targeted everything. It's that humans are the easiest, so that's the most that exists.
Yeah, and they say that Gene Stealer, orc hybrids smell wrong. They aren't orky enough.
To other orcs.
So the orcs attack them. But yeah, they were, there were instructions. I've got a copy, not a physical copy, but I've got a copy of the old White Dwarf where they're telling you how to make Gene Stealer orcs.
Yeah, I've actually got the PDF version of Gene Stealer orcs. And it's just and that's the thing. Like,
but, you know, they were purple, so shouldn't they have been like really sneaky?
Should have been real hard to see. But yeah, it's interesting. And there's still a flavor of Native American stuff with the I almost said Deathwing. And there's definitely hints of it in Dark Angels. They're not, it's not as overblown as it once was. But who knows? Will that planet come back? Will they talk about that stuff later?
They used to have names like Moon Bear and stuff like that.
Yeah. And a lot of it came out of the fact that, like, let's be perfectly honest, in the 1980s, the internet didn't exist. In fact, well, it did.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, the world wasn't as connected as it is now. And when you read a lot and you hear a lot of the interviews with Rick Priestley and Bryan Ansell and a lot of the other the Steve Jackson from Europe, not the Steve Jackson of Steve Jackson Games in the United States, and Ian Livingston. When you read things that all of these guys who are involved with what became Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Battle talk, a lot of the times they say, well, yeah, of course we did that because that was popular in popular culture in the 80s. And that was what we knew in London.
Yeah. So
the weird Native American standard was we don't really understand that, that culture. That culture is so far removed from ours. But what's really popular? Cowboys versus Indian movies. Okay, let's play with that idea. And then you find out in the 90s, okay, maybe some of that was a bit tasteless, tone it down a little bit, and then you tone it down a little bit. It's not that it's gone, it's that the company has made decisions to become more thoughtful of the people who play their game.
I have a friend who has been living in England for 20 years, married to another friend of ours, a lovely English lady. They have a couple of kids. I was just visiting them the other day, and they talk about American culture overseas and how English culture has been diluted through American media and all. And the thing is, you do get American culture was really becoming widespread back then, but it was through a lens. I mean, still try to get a burrito in London. It's not good. Any sort of Mexican food. I mean,
I try to get a burrito not in Southern California.
Okay, yeah. I don't want a Midwestern taco.
Actually, we found a place that's really good. As California transplants, we found a place that's really good. But anyway,
there's a place in the city next to my wife's grandmother, Windsor. I actually live right outside Windsor, California, but she lives right outside Windsor, UK, and that's where we go a couple times a year. But there's I don't know if it's a chain or not, but it's the California Burrito Shop, and I keep on saying I should stop in there just to see what it's like.
Just check it out. Maybe it's somebody from Baja California.
Yeah,
you never know.
Because
that's the thing. The place that we found that's really good is it's people from Mexico.
Yeah.
And it happened, it does. Transplants happen, but there's also a lot of there's a worldwide idea that the burrito is the bean and cheese and ground beef thing that Taco Bell makes.
Yeah. So, but getting back to 40K, I mean, this is also what we don't understand from the US is that we don't understand that orcs are football hooligans. And people don't even know what football hooligans are, so they don't even get that reference. And
if you don't get that reference, watch Green Street Hooligans, the movie, with Elijah Wood and Charlie, the dude from Charlie Hannon, the dude that's from Sons of Anarchy, made him really popular. But it's orcs. Yeah. Watch it. It's orcs. It's just a bunch of dudes fighting all the time.
and it was flavored through the punk scene in the early 80s. That's why you had the Czechs and the Spikes and all. You really see the different parts of the Imperium coming out from what Britain was going through politically at that time.
And a lot of the really, really, there's a lot of there's a lot of brutalism, I should say, not brutalist, but a lot of brutalism. There's a lot of Gothic movement, neo-Gothic movement stuff that's in 40K. The uniforms, especially the early uniforms for the Imperial Guard, was very reminiscent of the French in World War I. It's actually really funny because a lot of people have a very negative gut reaction. A lot of people who are not Warhammer fans have a very weird and negative reaction to the Kriegsman uniform because to them it calls up this idea of Nazi Germany, which is weird because the Kriegsman uniform is actually based on French World War I trench uniforms and has nothing other than the pith helmet with the spike, has nothing to do with Germany. And the pith helmet with the spike was only something that the Germans used up into the first couple of years of World War I. It was not something that
Prussian,
even...
Anyway. It's not,
it's Prussian. It's not even something that left.
If you want to see something that deals with the army of the guy with the funny mustache, look up the early Storm Boy sculpts, Orc Storm Boys.
The Mordians are very, SS Gestapo style uniforms. But again, like a lot of this stuff is just what militaria was in the 70s and 80s. And like the punk music movement specifically, David Bowie, the Ramones, who were New York Jews, and just a couple of other handfuls of guys that I can think of. Iggy Pop. There we go. Bowie, Iggy, the Ramones, a lot of the early punk music stuff, they would gravitate towards the World War II, excuse me, Axis powers uniforms as well, specifically the Nazi gear, because they were being shocking and they were being weird, and they were embracing that brutalistic outlook on life.
Yeah. And the Imperium of Man was very much the way that the British government was and is set up with the Church of England and all that. I mean, it very much goes through that. Maybe we should get back to chaos and the warp.
Definitely, yeah. Because this is the thing that we return to is like why is the Warhammer 40k empire really fascist? Well, because the punks that were making games in the 80s didn't like the fact that the government was kind of overbearing.
Well,
they were making a statement.
Before we move away from it, just the one thing that we need to acknowledge, and that GW has been trying to acknowledge, is that while they were making, at the beginning, they were making a social commentary against fascism and government fascism, it has been embraced by some elements of the hobby, and we have to make sure that we move away from that.
Yeah. So to get back to the big book, the book that started it all was the Realms of Chaos book, which was written and released in it was written before, it was released in 1988. It was a supplement for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but it's really where a lot of the image, the aesthetic for Chaos, the Chaos Warriors came from.
But it was also a supplement for second edition 40k, because it had rules for both. The book was split.
Yep. Yeah, the warp in Chaos was, for a while, the books that came out were meant for both. So to quote Bryan Ansell, who is one of the designers, in an interview about the design process itself, Michael Moorcock was an influence and inspiration. Michael Moorcock and Tolkien cast a massive shadow over the whole fantasy industry. In my case, Jack Vance and Clark Ashton Smith were equally important. I don't think our vision of Chaos Warriors overlaps much with Michael Moorcock, although we did occasionally borrow his arrow symbol. For me, all the roots of the Chaos Warriors that Citadel made over the years lie with Frank Frazzada's Death Dealer painting and sketches. And if you are on Patreon, we have the Death Dealer up right now, and there is a model in the current Chaos Fantasy line. I think it's a fine cast resin model. They haven't made it a plastic yet, but it's a very, very famous model that is 100% the Death Dealer. Anyway, the first few Chaos Warriors that Tony Auckland made at Asgard, and also some of the ones that Stan Proch made, and John Blanche's sketches from the early 80s, all kind of go back to this idea, the Frank Frazzada Death Dealer. I think that the first fantasy story I read were the Faraway Tree Tales by Eden Blayton. When I discovered fantasy, science fiction, and historical fiction in the 1960s, Moorcock wasn't visible enough yet to make it into my local library. I was enthusiastic about Jack Vance, Clark Ashton Smith, Harry Harrison, Fritz Lieber, Keith Lamar, James Blish, Robert Shakely, Bryan Ansell, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Kurt Vonnegut, Robert Heinlein, T.H. White, Cyril Judd, Fritz Lieber, Philip K. Dick, and others. Also, Russell Thorndike, Raphael Sabati, Hubert Cole, Alfred Dugan, Mary Renault, Henry Terrace, Jeffrey Terse, and Leslie Chartis. So this is Bryan talking about everything that inspired how he designed the models.
So it's interesting. So I knew I've read almost all of them except for when he goes into also.
Yeah. The also ones I don't quite know. And like we've already talked about Robert Heinlein. We haven't done an episode on Kurt Vonnegut, but we've talked about Kurt Vonnegut. We've mentioned Edgar Rice Burroughs already. Philip K. Dick, man, there's some weirdness there that we'll probably need to talk to about at some point. But this is all of the miasma that was going around when they were writing the book Realms of Chaos, the first Realms of Chaos. I think there are 3 Realms of Chaos books in the original publications, and now, you can still find them. So he goes on to say, I didn't discover Moorcock until the Hawkwind books in the early 70s. Tandem was publishing James Branch Cable and getting him to me via W.H. Smith at the round about the same time that Moorcock appeared on the scene. So I still associated them with each other. I don't think that Cable has had any influence on my fantasy gaming, but I'm quite obsessed with him and recommend Figures of Earth, The Silver Stallion, and Jurgen to anybody who might enjoy poetic Edwardian prose and sly wit. So I definitely see where James Branch Cabell came in to some of his stuff, just continuing down the trend. But it's interesting to kind of hear from the man himself what some of this was.
I was just trying to look up the age of these guys because
they were all kids in the 60s.
Yeah, I think they're just like a couple of years older than I am. I was trying to...
They're definitely upper cusp X/boomers, like whatever that weird micro generation is. I believe they're all kind of from there.
In 89, when this came out, right? 88, 89.
88.
I just graduated college.
Right.
I would have graduated college in 88 if I didn't take me 5 years to get through. So I graduated in 89. So I was 22. And I'm looking at pictures of them at Games Workshop. They were not that old.
Yeah, they were like 25, 26. Like they were not much older. I was 8, if it makes you feel better. I was getting into all of this stuff. I was getting into the art side of it.
Tremendously better.
Does it make your knees hurt a little bit?
No, but when I go on my 6 mile trail run tomorrow, I'll think about you because I know that you aren't doing that right now.
Well, my since COVID, weird aside, since COVID, my lungs haven't really like gotten all the way back to where I want them to be.
It took me a couple of months. But I finally got. I know people that are suffering from long COVID. Yeah, I have to say that the Frazetta stuff that you put up is stirring old feelings. But you aren't putting up the ones with the bikini clad or the bare-breasted women. I probably shouldn't say that. I'm
specifically bringing up the Frank Frazetta stuff that kind of inspired the look of the Chaos and Chaos Marauders. Not quite the cheesecake stuff that definitely fits a little bit more into Conan the Barbarian's realm. So while the book Realms of Chaos does outline the 4 entities that would become the Chaos Gods, this is still the very early stages of their development, and it was mostly a drive towards the look. So a lot of it had more to do with how the models looked and a lot less to what the world building side would be. It's also probably important to point out that at this time, the Chaos line was very, very popular, and people bought them for all sorts of other things, including D&D games and all of the other like one-shots and splats that Games Workshop was publishing. This is the late 80s, where Games Workshop and Citadel were sister companies, with Games Workshop publishing books and Citadel making miniatures. Citadel at this point was a lot more like Reaper, if you guys are familiar with Reaper miniatures today. The miniatures were targeted at the Warhammer and Dungeons & Dragons fandom, but they were made to fit anything in this fantasy or science fiction genre. And that's kind of how Reaper is now. Reaper is very targeted at filling the niche of people need D&D miniatures. People need fantasy gaming miniatures. Reaper has their own, I believe, free rules, or they did. I don't know if they do anymore, but at one point they did have their own free rule book, and there was at one point Reaper books you could buy. But Reaper is a miniatures company. Citadel is a miniatures company. Games Workshop which now owns both of them. There's now one company. There has been synergy. At this point, they're a publishing company. So Games Workshop is republishing Dungeons and Dragons. They're writing their own one-shots. They're publishing 2000 AD. They're publishing a couple of other games. But by and large, Games Workshop does books and Citadel does miniatures when this book is being written.
Yeah.
Well, another further quote of Bryan Ansell on this entire process kind of goes into where the names for the gods came from, which I thought was pretty interesting. I actually knew a lot of it, but I think it's interesting to hear it from him. So Nurgle is an actual god. Nurgle is a Babylonian god, and it's Nergal. Nergal, not Nurgle, is a Babylonian god whose dates back to prehistoric times. He was still around to be worshipped by the Assyrians. They changed the spelling because I thought Nurgle was more amusing. Also, it could be the sound of a death rattle or air being expelled from a rotting, putrescent carcass. Nergal was a god of death, disease, and pestilence, also a god of war and ruler of the underworld. Sometimes also his wife would be depicted this way. As he had been around for a very long time, his attributes have changed back and forth over the years. I'm sure he's extremely pleased that we still are thinking of him. Perhaps with all the attention, we might eventually conjure up a physical manifestation. An old Babylonian god would be creepy. So he goes on to say, Khorn was derived from Conan's Crom, who is an actual Celtic god who can also be spelled Crom or Cram. Slaanesh was meant to be a sibilant, erotic, breathy, whispered, or murmured sound. The models didn't quite turn out as erotically charged as I had hoped.
Yeah,
Tzeentch was
back in the day.
Yeah,
none of them were that good.
Back in the day, yeah. He got his time. He got his answer in the 90s for a short amount of time. Tzeentch was meant to sound like a spell blasting out, like a Doctor Strange comic. It also has a sort of Aztec feel, which goes with the feathers and bright pastel colors that Tzeentch has. We didn't plan any other powers during my time other than perhaps the gods of law and Malal, who obviously is gone, doesn't exist currently. And eventually, Ansell was actually involved in the moves to consolidate Games Workshop and Citadel into one company, which was then based in Nottingham, and it's pretty close to what we know today. Although today, a lot of that original crew has either left or retired. With that move, the idea of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k as standalone games became much closer to reality. And with that came a lot of structure and world building. And that's kind of our aim today as we get into H.P. Lovecraft. So to continue with some of these old guys' quotes, we'll go to some quotes from Rick Priestley. You've got a lot of old guys' quotes in here. I do. It's kind of to really set up the fact that, like, we're coming from a place, guys. This is a thing. Rick Priestley says, when we developed Warhammer in the early days, Richard and I incorporated a lot of science fiction elements into it. The world as we wrote it was created by a spacefaring race called the Slan, and they'd terraformed and bioengineered it into a present state. Coincidentally, it conforms to an archetype which looks a bit like our own world. So it begs the question, is Earth another planet that had been created by the Slan? We were inspired by things like Philip Jose Farmer's World of Tears, which is a series of books about artificial creation. It's
a artificially created worlds. It's a good series.
Thank you.
Or at least I remember it being good. I don't know if I would still say it's good if I reread it today, but Philip Jose Farmer was a great writer. And I used to love those books.
There's also a lot of the kind of things in the Cthulhu mythos as well, the great old ones and the galaxy-spanning races going back to E.E. Doc Smith. You've got these two civilizations that go out and seed the entire galaxy. Warhammer World is essentially conceived as a science fiction world, which had gone the fantasy route. Mm-hmm. He continues in the same interview to say, one of the briefs that I had to respect was that I had to make up rules for all the science fiction models as we made them. For example, we had a Judge Dredd license and people had Judge Dredd miniatures, so they had to be able to use them in the game. They also had a BBC license, so we had Daleks and Cybermen. We also had the Call of Cthulhu license, so we had all of these Call of Cthulhu monsters, and we had the D&D license, so I had to include all the D&D monsters. I ended up with a list as long as my arm. If you look through the original Rogue Trader book, you'll see all of those things are in it. Judges are there as Arbites, Daleks are there as exterminators, displacer beasts are there is something I can't even remember. And you can go into the warp creatures and see all this stuff.
I don't remember the eliminators. I'm going to have to pull up my copy and take a look at that.
Oh, the Dalek exterminators. Yeah. I can't remember what they kind of became further on, but they're in it. Yeah, go back and look. It's pretty fun. But as we all know, and Chac and I have already talked about earlier in the episode, the conflict that is at the core of Warhammer and Warhammer 40k eventually settled into a balance of the forces of the Emperor, an immortal corpse, and the forces of chaos. And this is about the time where the idea of him being dead and stuck on a throne and dying was introduced. As Chac mentioned earlier, Rogue Trader, he's a guy who's wounded. First edition, he's essentially quasi-dead and on a throne. Like, it was a very, you're looking at 88 to 90, maybe?
Yeah.
Like, it was that fast. It happened that quickly. It happened in the next revision, essentially. And it met a need. Historical wargaming had been my brown guys versus your blue guys, and people that were playing 40k wanted my brown Space Marines versus your blue Space Marines. So Games Workshop, now the merged company, was like, well, how do we meet that need?
I was just looking. I just pulled up my copy of Rogue Trader.
You're looking through it. I have mine right here. Look at that. Look at this.
Yeah, I understand we can get a printed copy of it.
I know. I went through all of this hard trouble to get somebody I knew in England to buy it for me and send it to me, which they did.
Go to Warhammer World and picking it up for you.
Yeah. Only for them to 8 months later be like, hey, we're going to sell it to us, but it's only limited. So there is a chance. Yeah.
Nottingham is too far north. I don't usually get up there when I'm in England.
Yeah.
I did drag my wife into a Warhammer store and her friend, and my wife was trying to explain to our friend 40k
what this is
by not actually knowing what it is.
I'm always kind of tickled by the what do our wives and our girlfriends think these things are? You show them a picture and then you have them kind of explain it from the little bit of excess knowledge that they've gotten from sitting in the same room with us crazy people.
Yeah.
It's always amusing. It's always very amusing. So Priestley goes on to further explain, originally the Chaos Warriors and demons and gods were created by Bryan Ansell. We already read some quotes by him. He wrote a supplement for Warhammer 1st edition called Realms of Chaos, and it was inspired by Michael Moorcock books where you have gods of law and the gods of chaos. Bryan replicated the idea of chaos as this mutating thing in creating his four gods, Khorn, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. I was always a bit worried about the fact that it was so close to Michael Moorcock, so I merged in the idea of the chaos gods with the idea of primal chaos, from a kind of medieval Renaissance background, more specifically as depicted in Milton's Paradise Lost. It describes primal gods as lying between heaven and hell, and earth is basically hanging within chaos. Lucifer is cast into hell and falls through chaos, and that just brings out all of this really interesting story stuff.
Yeah.
That's how we get the mix of how early chaos developed. The art style of Frank Frazetta with the fictional cues from Moorcock and Robert E. Howard, a dose of Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and a helping of Milton's Paradise Lost. And I want to say, Chac, we've talked about this before, but if you are kind of wondering where the story beats of the Horus Heresy came from, it is sci-fi Paradise Lost.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah.
It's so close. Yeah. But today, we're here to talk about Lovecraft. And we set up where a lot of these ideas came from. And now we're ready to talk more directly about Lovecraft. So let's give you some context into who Howard Phillips Lovecraft was. He was an American writer of weird science fiction, fantasy, and horror. He is best known for his creation of the Cthulhu mythos. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and he spent most of his early life, or actually most of his life in entirety, in New England. However, his father was institutionalized in 1893, and he was able to live a upper-class lifestyle, really being an inheritor of his family's wealth until it dissipated after the death of his grandfather. And it's a little hazy. Was a lot of it spent on the health of his father and on the health of his grandfather, and that's why it went away. Or, grandfather dies, all the kids fight over it, Lovecraft is too young to really benefit from any of that. But he then went to living with his mother, and they were very poor. And then his mother was institutionalized in 1919. It's around this time that he began to write essays for the United Amateur Press Association. And he kind of went back and forth writing for pulp magazines and being more involved with pulp fiction. He became active later in speculative fiction community and was published in several pulp magazines. He moved to New York, marrying Sonia Green in 1924, and later became the center of a wider group of authors known as the Lovecraft Circle. They introduced him into Weird Tales, which became his most prominent publisher. Lovecraft's time in New York took a toll on him mentally and financially, and he eventually returned to Providence in 1926 and produced some of his most popular works, including The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Shadow Out of Time. He remained active as a writer for another 11 years until he died of cancer at 46 years old. So Lovecraft passed away in the late 40s, early 50s. His writing is based on the idea of cosmicism, which was also simultaneously his own philosophy. Cosmicism kind of suggests that humanity is this insignificant part of the cosmos that can be swept away at any moment. He incorporated his fantasy and science fiction elements into these stories and into his philosophy, representing the perceived fragility of our existence, of what humanity means to be. Without getting further into, well, do you want to talk about Lovecraft, or do we want to deal with the elephant in the room?
About his...
Should we tear the bandage off?
So he was not unique in his view of
a white man in the 1920s.
Yeah, of an upper class white man in the 1920s.
Yeah.
His writing is at the best not complimentary, and at the worst outright racist at times.
Racist, yeah. Yeah.
I don't
anti-Semitic, racist. Yeah.
He talks about these sort of dark, swarthy races. He talks about these degenerate races and how, and it usually that encompasses, and in these days, he's not just talking about like people of African extraction. He's talking about like Italians and Jews and all these sorts of things. Basically, if you
this is a time period where phrenology was accepted.
Oh yeah,
This
was also at the beginning of really learning about evolution and all. You know, Darwin was in the 1850s or whatever. Didn't publish to the end of his life. And so there's this big movement of, sort of like trying to categorize peoples through evolutionary means. It's, as an anthropologist, I can tell you it's all bullshit. Everybody is the same. There are no separate races. Those are all social constructs. And they're just a way that we use to separate ourselves from each other and to rank people lower than ourselves.
In the miasma of, cosmicism is I'm looking for the word, like a splinter, really. It's like a cult. It's not really a cult, but it's like a cult mentality. And in the spiritualism, that's what I was looking for.
Spiritualism.
Cosmicism is like a type of spiritualism. And in the spiritualists movement, Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, like none of these people had really nice things to say about people that weren't white.
Yeah. So there were two major themes that run through Lovecraft's works, and I'm talking specifically about Lovecraft, not Lovecraftian. In his works, the two themes are humans are insignificant. When he talks about
insects,
the great old ones, I mean, if you're walking down the street, you might see a bug and you might decide to step on it, or you might decide to step around it. They don't even do that. They just walk down the street. We are completely insignificant. So there's a little bit of a difference people describe the Chaos Gods as being like Lovecraft's Great Old Ones, but they're not, because the Chaos Gods are too involved with what goes on with humans.
The Slan, the Great Old Ones in 40k, that are the ones who created the Slan, are the Great Old Ones from the Cthulhu mythos. They created everything, and now they're gone.
Yeah, there is only one deity in Lovecraft's works, and it's with Randolph Carter in The Dreams of Unknown Kadeth in his dream cycle, who actually seems to care about humans or interact with them in any way, and that is Gnarly Hopetep.
Yeah.
But so you sort of have this, humans are insignificant. They just don't even register with the Great Old Ones. And then you have the cults that worship these beings.
The Great Old Ones.
And they are usually degenerates. They are groups of people who are inbred in the swamps, who have sort of have mutations and have degenerated. They're not fit. They've got weird physical deformities. They've got all this. And of course, that also ties in with Innsmouth, if you read that story. But so
the shadow over Innsmouth deals very specifically with a cult to Dagon, who's one of these entities, and what happens
isn't one of those
the longer
entities.
you're part. Dagon is a lesser. He's not.
We don't even know what Dagon is. There's some.
I have the full BC. I'm pulling it up. Keep going.
So you have Mother Dagon, who is you have the mother and the father. We don't know if they're just like more advanced old ones. Not old one, deep ones, sorry. More advanced deep ones or older deep ones. We don't know if they're actually gods, and he never really says it in the books. Anywhere in the books.
They're just other things.
They're other things. See, that's the whole thing. Lovecraft doesn't actually explain a lot of this. He just puts it out there.
And that's kind of the point. That's the point of cosmicism, is that we don't understand it. So the Lovecraft bestiary, if you will, is split, and this is the expanded
and a lot
mythos.
Of the lore that goes into this was not written by Lovecraft. This has been written.
It was written later.
Yeah, that's why I said there's a difference between Lovecraft and Lovecraftian.
And a lot of times, what Lovecraft did, epic before Games Workshop existed, Games Workshop move. Lovecraft was a master at the hanging one-liner. Yeah. And it's through extrapolation of the hanging one-liner that everything else kind of exists. So the outer gods are Azazoth, Yog-Shoggoth, all of like the kind of crazy big ones that he talks about. The great old ones, which are like below the outer gods, that's where Cthulhu falls. That's where Dagon falls. And then there are lesser servitor races, greater servitor races, greater independent races, and lesser independent races. And this gets into like everything else. The Migo is a lesser independent race. I think they're just called the Old Ones. They're what are they in the Mountains of Madness? They're just called the Old Ones, right?
They're the Old Ones, or because there's a difference between the Old Ones and the Elder Ones. I think they're just called the Old Ones.
The Elder Ones. They're the Elder Ones.
Yeah.
So the elder things that they come across in the Mountains of Madness are a lesser servitor race. So they're a race they're like men before men existed, essentially.
Basically,
they're aliens.
They're aliens, and so are the Migo, and so are a bunch of those. They aren't necessarily hooked directly into the mythos. They're just star-spanning aliens who have landed on Earth.
Or things that got ripped out and are now attacking us. The color out of space, and all of this stuff kind of gets into. And there's a really great. I've got it pulled up right now. If you're part of our Patreon, you can see it. There's kind of a great bestiary that goes across like what everything is.
And there's a timeline there also with when they're on Earth.
Yeah. To get back to something you were saying, because I have a question for you. And I actually think We kind of talked in our production side meeting. We kind of talked about how we were going to argue over a couple of things, and I actually think we're a lot more aligned than you realized. But in your estimation, a lot of the influences that came from Lovecraft or the Lovecraftian mythos, the Cthulhu mythos, is the fact that there are these old ancient things that humans find and decide to worship, not that these old ancient things give a shit about man.
They don't actually interact with, even in 40k, the chaos gods don't, they only care about the wars in the materium as to how that interacts the bigger war in the immaterium. They don't really
how does it benefit them?
Care what goes on here. But so a lot of the stuff that I see that has the greatest link to 40k is the cults and the mutants and all that are worshiping other things. So,
and usually those other things are some bastardization of the actual ancient god.
So I think that Lovecraft really ties into, like, I think there are a lot of Lovecraft images and associations within the Inquisitor series, the expanded Inquisitor series. And you've got the King in Yellow up there, which is not Lovecraft, but it is Lovecraftian because
it's part of the expanded mythos.
Yes, it was written. The King in Yellow is a play that when people read it, they go crazy. And the book, The King in Yellow, has 4 acts in it. The first act, basically, a guy reads it and he thinks he is the emperor of a alternate America in the 1920s. The second one,
before you go any further, so The King in Yellow is written by Robert W. Chambers, and it's 9 short stories and several poems. It was released in 1895. But as Chac just said, even though it's these different short stories and these poems, it's all a 4-act play.
Yeah.
It's short stories that all lead into this 4-act
And you
play.
only ever hear about stuff through the end of Act 1. Because if you read more than the Act 1, you go crazy.
You go nuts.
And then Lovecraft references it, and he references things like the Lake of Holly and some locations, but he doesn't actually. He did not write The King in Yellow. He did not.
The King in Yellow isn't his idea.
It isn't his idea. It has been thought, or the inference is that The King in Yellow is Hastur, which is one of the Lovecraft gods. But Hastur is a entity that was written by Ambrose Bierce before Lovecraft, and Lovecraft only basically what Lovecraft does is he name drops.
Yes,
He talks about these books that mention these places, and he names drops these places from earlier and books and entities from earlier authors, but he doesn't expand on them.
And a lot of this stuff all feeds into the philosophy of cosmicism, the idea that we are insignificant in the true machinations of the universe. The universe doesn't care about a singular entity, a singular person. We are a blip. It's like an extreme version of nihilism.
Yeah.
And all of these, The King in Yellow, E.E. Cummings had written some stuff too that had even come out around, not E.E. Cummings. I can't remember. E.E. Cummings is the name that I'm associating with, but I'm pretty sure E.E. Cummings was in the 1900s. But there was another 1800s author that also kind of circled around this stuff. Edgar Allan Poe, the Mask of the Red Death, The Fall of the House of Usher. There's all sorts of other cosmic weirdness that happens to humans, that humans internalize as being focused on them. They internalize, I am the focus, this is out to get me. But if you peel back the layer of the story that the author is writing, the humans are just accidentally in the way of something much greater that's been happening. Or in the case with some of Lovecraft's stories, they're dealing with something that appears to be godlike, but in the actual breakdown of the bestiary of the mythos is nowhere near the top.
Yeah.
like the Migo, for instance, or the Elder Things. They're just weird aliens.
Yeah.
They're just weird Xenos. They're not gods. And like, why do the Elder Things pull apart the crew in the Mountains to Madness? The Elder Things pull apart the crew in the Mountains to Madness because the crew autopsies one of their dead. And then they're like, well, we don't know what these things are either, so we're going to autopsy one of them. Or not autopsy. What's it called when it's done when you're alive?
Vivisection.
There's a name. Vivisection, yeah. To vivisect a couple of the dudes.
Yeah, and these are... So most of what Lovecraft wrote were quite short stories. He did write a couple of what we consider to be novellas.
Yeah.
At the Mountains of Madness was probably a novella. Call of Cthulhu is someplace in there, but it's not long. We're talking about like 80 pages.
I mean, the entire the entire writings of H.P. Lovecraft are, to give you guys an idea, I have it up on my shelf. The entire writings of H.P. Lovecraft are as thick as the first book in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
As a hardback book. So it's a couple thousand pages. It's pretty close to 3,000 pages, but I mean, like, there isn't a 2,000 page novel about Cthulhu.
Yeah.
Cthulhu is Cthulhu is actually mentioned more than once, but Cthulhu is mentioned in brief in different conversations. Cthulhu is not ever, and that's kind of the way, if I can posit something, that the actual chaos gods act. They're mentioned. They're there. Khorn is there, and you can run into Khorn. Is Khorn trying to kill a guardsman unit? Absolutely not. Khorn doesn't give a shit. Is Khorn trying to destroy the Corpse Emperor and bring all of humanity to end? Yes. Is he doing it because he doesn't like humans? No. He's doing it because he needs the blood to power himself. Like, he needs that. None of it is done because he doesn't like you.
Yeah.
It's just done as part of what he is. The things in the warp, the things in Warhammer 40k and in Warhammer Fantasy that interact with the chaos entities that interact and are selfish and have these are demons. They are demon princes. They are greater. They're that alien thing. That's the level that they're at. They give a crap about human politics because they're not that far removed from human politics.
And some of them were human.
Yes, and very recently.
Yes, and not 10,000 years ago, because remember, they're in the warp and time flows differently. They were right. Humans maybe a couple hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago.
And some of them, like Abaddon, aren't actually trying to do. I mean, they are using the chaos gods as a tool to get their own ends, and that comes into that that cult thing. But yeah, I am very much in agreement with you. The majority of it, to me, seems to be in the things that humans do when they find something they're not supposed to know about.
So in the Shadow over Innsmouth, you have a sea captain that finds an idol and starts using that to communicate with the race of old ones. And the old ones say, we'll bring you gold if you bring us the deep ones, if you bring us virgins, basically. And they interbreed, and then they start to degenerate and become mutants. In the Call of Cthulhu, it starts out with an idol that is found deep in the swamps of Louisiana by this sort of degenerate tribe that is worshiping it. So what I was saying is, we don't actually know what Cthulhu looks like. You've got an image, if you're a Patreon member, you've got an image on the screen of Cthulhu, and it's always basically a giant bat-winged monstrosity, bipedal with an octopus face, basically. But that's what the idol looks like that's worshipped in the story Call of Cthulhu. But when you actually read the description in the book, it's just sort of this towering shadow that's moving
this
in the
weird
background.
Thing, and like he appears in dreams, and it's humanity is like the fever dream of Cthulhu. Like yeah, it's the concept of what Cthulhu is very interesting. And it's all that sort of, it worms its way, you know, the dreams of this god may have birthed humanity, and at the same time is worming its way. It's not even a god, this great elder thing, and it's worming its way into the dreams of humans, and then humans are worshiping it. And that's so much the way that, like, when you read, you brought up the Inquisitor series, so we'll go back to the Inquisitor series by Dan Abnett. When you read about how these cults start, when you read the clues, it's not that direct thing, but it's that theme. This idea that, like, I had this weird inspiration. I had this night terror, and this night terror let me in on a cosmic truth. And now that I have this cosmic truth, I know more than the authorities do. I know more than the sanctioned religion does. Right. So I'm going to go off and become my own thing. And, like, this goes back to Logar and the fact that Logar is looking into what is the primordial truth? What is the primordial basis? The theme that runs through the Cthulhu mythos, the expanded past Lovecraft, the expanded Cthulhu mythos that's being kind of wrapped up into popular modern culture, is the fact that when you start to poke and look at those dark things take a notice of you, and they start to manipulate you to their end. And that's really where Lovecraft and the warp cross over.
Yeah. So if you look at, I think it is the second book in the Ravener trilogy by
it's Dan
Abnett
Dan
that wrote
Abnett.
all of them. Yeah, it's Abnett. Okay, so Ravener is the Inquisitor, and he's got an interrogator who they're going after these people that are trafficking in this drug, which are these what they call them glints.
Flecks.
They're little shards of glass. Flecks. And when you look into these flecks, these little shards of glass, you see visions of what you're actually doing. These are chaos tainted, and you're seeing a vision from chaos. And the interrogator gets hooked on these, and by looking in them, he opens a doorway for chaos to enter him, and he ends up hosting.
He becomes a demon host.
He becomes a demon host.
And it's so insidious too, because the flecks are only in circulation because a set of planets got pulled into the warp and they were exposed. So the flecks are glass on demon worlds that are in the warp, that are really close to the sector that the story takes place in, that were basically like think of like a nuclear explosion happens and all the glass gets blasted out. But because it all gets blasted out, it becomes tainted. But the people that went to those planets didn't go to get the glass. They had no idea the glass was going to become a psychotropic drug. They were going to get the machinery of the Adaptus Mechanicus and of the Adaptus Administratum that was left on those planets to sell those machines on the black market. So the flecks are a side effect of a side effect. And it's so Lovecraftian. Because the bad thing that starts the whole story or starts the whole process is usually actually pretty bad. But, like, the thing that makes the dude go nuts and become a demon is, like, the tertiary side effect.
Yeah. And actually, I think the expanded Inquisitor, it's now 9 books.
Well, it's 8. 9 is coming out soon.
Books. 9's coming out. Is actually really follows a lot of the Lovecraft theme.
Well, I mean, the entire...
And you have cults and mutants and all these sorts of things. And it's, of course, ending up with the whole King in Yellow.
Yep.
Which, by the way, if you don't have me on that discussion, I'll be very angry.
I have a feeling that's going to be a discussion between the two. At some point, we will do the Eisenhorn series, the Ravener series, and the Patient Kiss is a side, and the Beckwin series. We'll talk about all three of them. And that'll definitely be a conversation. That'll be a you and I conversation with you and I with guests, not yeah.
So and not to ruin, but I think where they're all going towards looking at the end is the equivalent of like maybe Lost Carcosa, or maybe I think it's part. I think they're riffing on the dream. Abnett's ripping on the dream cycle.
I definitely do, and I think that
or
even
Cadith, or yeah,
I think even the big reveal at the end of book 8 is done as a false positive, or as because I think even if that person's body is the vessel for this thing, I don't think that person is involved anymore. His body might be, but I don't think that person exists anymore. And I don't want to, the book came out recently enough that to name drop is going to spoil stuff.
No,
but
you can find on the internet
who the King in Yellow is.
Who the King in Yellow is supposed to be. I think it's false also.
Yes.
I've come up with a couple of ideas who it might be if you stick with actual 40k lore, but I'm just out there. It could be somebody completely new that we haven't heard of yet.
Exactly. And I think Abnett is a writer, an accomplished enough writer, and somebody who's been writing for a long enough period of time that going back to these old literary standards and playing with these ideas, that, you know, there's definitely, he has said himself that Arthur Conan Doyle inspired one of the ways that he approached one of the series, the Beckwin series. He has specifically said he tried to mix in a lot of Charles Dickens style imagery into a lot of the stuff that he did, as far as the Undercity goes, and the tombs of Queen Mab. They're not the tombs, but there's an entire underworld of the city of Queen Mab, and that was a very like Charles Dickens style thing that he was going for. And it's all of this mixture, and whether or not, you know, to return to the concept of who Lovecraft was as a person, whether or not Lovecraft was a good person, Lovecraft's literature has had a massive impact on pretty much everything in the modern literary world. Anne Rice, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, all openly say that their writing styles are based on Lovecraft. And like, these are not minor people. These are heavy hitters in modern horror. Obviously, Rick Priestley, the designer of 40k, has said that there's influences from the Lovecraftian mythos and from Lovecraft himself. Dan Abnett has started to play with things from the greater Cthulhu mythos, may not necessarily being pulled directly from Lovecraft's work, but there's that idea. The structure that Lovecraft used to write his stories, and the idea of the existential non-importance of humans is very much part of grimdark, and it's very much part of modern sci-fi fantasy.
He's very much has worked on. So what Lovecraft did is he exploited his own fear of the unknown and the other, very much of the other. And because a lot of his stories deal with things like cults, and by the other, we definitely do mean non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Yeah, anybody who doesn't look like me. And again, this comes, you know, Lovecraft's early life, he was rich. He was a child of prosperity, and then he lost everything and was thrown into a world that he didn't understand, and very complicated, incredibly fearful person. It is a good way to sum him up. This was a dude who was absolutely petrified of his own shadow.
Yeah, and he comes out. I mean, unlike also, and he is not. His horror writing is not of the slasher variety. So, and what I mean about that is he leaves a lot of it up to your imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. You are to fill in the darkness that you're not supposed to see.
Yeah. Rats in the Walls is a wonderful one. And it talks about this degenerate group of people living under this England mansion that had been kept as human cattle for the Lord to eat. Literally, it's cannibalism. And
The Dunwich Horror deals with the fact that like the second son or the seventh son of a guy who dabbled too much in the dark arts of sorcery comes into his own power, and there's a lot of beast men references, like the way that the child looks, the way that this demon child looks. And this is again one of those things where like this sorcerer married this weird albino woman, and like specifically because she was weird and had that her weirdness gave him extra power. And like that's what it all is. It's all of this idea of these outsiders, these others, these unexplained members of society in the 1920s, which was kind of a creepy period.
And, you know, I really see things like I see the influence of Lovecraft in the Skaven, especially the way he talks about Lovecraft has this whole series where he talks about the ghouls. The ghouls are not, don't think of ghouls as in actually even Warhammer fantasy ghouls, because the ghouls aren't undead. They are these mutated. They're people.
They're people who eat the flesh of the living, and that's actually
they eat the flesh of the dead.
The dead. Thank you. And that's actually the classical representation of a ghoul. And they have this civilization that lives in the sewers underneath the cities.
Yeah, and they're also in the Dream Quest.
There was a movie that we watched not that long ago. Timothée Chalamet is in it. And they don't call them ghouls, but they're definitely ghouls. Bones and All is the name of the movie. And it's about people who are born with the desire to eat flesh. And Timothée Chalamet and there's a gal, I can't remember the actress's name, are both in it. And they fall in love. And I think it takes place in like the 60s or 70s. It must take place in the 70s or 80s, because there's a lot of rock and roll from that era in it, like Kiss and stuff like that are in it. But like the idea is that people are born, ghouls are born. People are just born and that's the thing. They like eating flesh. And like, it's really slow burny, creepy. And that's what all of this stuff is. Like,
yeah.
Actually,
there are no jump scares.
Yeah.
In Lovecraft. But you don't necessarily sleep well after reading some of these stories.
It's creeping horror. It's existential horror. Obviously, with the way that I approached when I sat down, I don't know how much of this you actually know, Chac, but when I sat down and pitched the idea of what would become Under the Hive of Madness, the idea essentially was how to talk about lore and world building and literature that interests and excites me. And Under the Hive of Madness is a literary reference to In the Mountains of Madness, very specifically. But a lot of the stuff that we've done in our world building also comes out of the expanded Cthulhu mythos. And I wanted to, before we wrap up here, before we get final thoughts here, I wanted to read an excerpt from Cassilda's song, which is in Act 1, Scene 2 of the play The King in Yellow, from the book that we had mentioned by Robert W. Chambers. And again, lots of Cthulhu-like feels, but this was written by an author that inspired Cthulhu, that inspired Lovecraft. That's the way to say that, right?
Yeah.
Along the shore, the cloud waves break. Twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that Hades shall sing, where the flaps, the tatters of king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Songs of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung, as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. And if you have been a member of either our Discord or have been following the podcast for a long time, the Innsmouth, the planet that we run our radio show for. Obviously, Innsmouth Hive is a reference to the shadow over Innsmouth. It is on a planet called Arconia, which is a reference to Arkham, which is a city in the Cthulhu mythos, not just a insane asylum from Batman. And then Carcosan sector.
It's in Rhode Island.
And then the Carcosan, yeah, right. And then the Carcosan sector is the sector that everything is in. Mm-hmm. We played around and we attached all of to this, but even in just the imagery, think of the warp and go back and listen to the passage that I read. Strange is the night where black stars rise. Stars aren't black. Strange moons circle through the sky. We only have one moon. Like, it's just all of these things that are a little off, a little not right, things that you don't want to think about or feel or deal with. Do you have any wrap-up thoughts or ending thoughts, anything you feel that we haven't touched yet? I feel like we could do another 2 episodes on this. So.
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of it. It's you definitely see there are definitely influences of Lovecraft in 40k. Obviously, Priestley said there is, but it's not direct.
There is no.
If you don't have Judge Dredd in the Arbites, you have this sort of like overall feeling. And like I said, I think Dan Abnett actually embodies it best in what he's been doing with the Inquisitor series. And I didn't see it at first, but with Family Gaw, there's a Glaw. 7.
Yep.
Glaw.
The Glaw.
And how that's all. I did not get it because I'd read some of these so far apart. And it wasn't until I started rereading them all together that I started seeing all the links, how all these 9 now books are all linked together into a single story. But a lot of those elements have sort of that cult underlying sort of horror and this other thing there. And I think the other thing in the Beckwin series, they talk about the City of Dust, which they're looking for. And the City of Dust, especially, she actually shows up there at the end.
It's very
much like the from the it gives you the feeling of the Dream Quest. The Dream Quest is a series of books or stories that Lovecraft wrote that is not traditional Lovecraft. It is you go to sleep and you go to the dreamlands, and the dreamlands are strange in the way that dreams are, but they're also strange in the ways that the warp is.
And it's what is the place that you go to? It's not Carcosa.
It's the dreamlands, but there are different destinations within the dreamlands. Like you can go to Ulthar. Ulthar is the place where they tried to kill all the cats. Because you have the cats of Ulthar. You have all these different cities, and if you read the sort of it has a hero in it that's Randolph Carter. And Randolph Carter is also, he's the one that deals with the ghouls in Pickman's Model and a bunch of these other things. And Randolph Carter is actually H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, he writes himself into it.
He writes himself, and this is this reoccurring hero, but is also completely incapable of doing everything because he's so scared type of thing. And I think what we're going to see is I really see the City of Dust as going to be part of this whole dream cycle. I think that's where you're pulling in Lovecraft. But there's no direct Great Cthulhu. There's nothing like that in the Dream Quest. It has quite a different feeling. It has much more of a fantasy feeling than a horror feeling. There
is no direct correlation between the great old ones of Lovecraft's writings of the mythos and the chaos gods. If you want an almost direct one-to-one comparison, a lot of the elder things in the the Warcraft world by Blizzard are very, very reminiscent of a lot of the Cthulhu mythos beings. Like there's There's an entity that's essentially Yog-Shoggoth. There's an entity that is essentially Cthulhu. There's an entity that is essentially Neo-Rathalop. There are these direct correlations between those two. And when you come to the Warhammer 40k universe, it's a little bit more that the idea of Yog-Shoggoth, what Yog-Shoggoth is, and what the Shoggoths that came from Yog-Shoggoth are, is just the way that demon entities work in the warp. They have no shape. They've got no rules. They're the raw essence of bubbling eyes and continuous creation, mouths coming out of every available surface. Those ideas, that raw otherness of like material creation comes across, but there is no direct analog.
If there was anything in Lovecraft that sort of has a directed like hooks to the chaos gods, I would have to say that's Nyarlathotep, or I don't know how you say anything.
Yeah, but, very, very Tzeentchian in a lot of ways.
Yes, and that's the only one of the chaos gods or the greater beings that actually interacts directly with humans, and it does it during the Dream Quest.
Yeah.
It's also been called, like, in the expanded universe, the expanded universe, sort of like the Dark Pharaoh and stuff like that, which also gives the idea of the King in Yellow, although the King in Yellow has been shown to be Hastur, which is a whole nother thing. So
what we're ending up with when we talk about a lot of concepts like this is like where do the ideas come from? We're not trying to lay out a map that shows how the stories are the same. We're trying to lay out a map that shows how ideas permeate culture.
Yeah, these are just things that influenced. There's not 40k is not Lovecraftian, but it draws from it.
Yeah, it's like 10% Lovecraftian. You would never say that Warhammer 40k exists in the Cthulhu mythos.
No.
I don't think the planet I don't think the planet gets to 40k in the Cthulhu mythos. But when we go back from the lore side and talk about the War in Heaven and the Great Old Ones, there is a lot of Great Old Ones stuff that very much feels directly from the mythos.
Oh yeah, the Enslavers.
Oh yeah. The fact that no one really knows what the Great Old Ones are, like the Great Old Ones, and they share a name with the Lovecraftian mythos. There's just all of these things that no one knows what they are.
Okay, so what are the Catan called? What are the Catan?
The Catan are the star.
Yeah, come on, you're almost there.
Star children?
No. They're star vampires.
Star vampires, thank you.
And there's that is very close to what some of the entities are in.
There is a lesser independent race in the mythos called the Star Vampire.
Yeah. Although the Catan are called the Star Vampires because they literally eat stars. They eat stars.
Yeah, the Catan are, if I were to place the Catan somewhere, they would be I think they'd probably be at the same level of the mythos. If you look at the mythos, they would just be another weird thing that exists. The Catan are not the old ones. And I know that people mix those.
Yes, but remember, we are, when we talk about the Catan in a 40k setting, we are talking about shards. We are not talking about the original.
The full god. Yeah, they've been broken.
Full god mode Catan that was eating stars. These big amorphous energy vampire. We're talking about this is what's on the screen, which is not what the Catan is. That is a shard of the Catan.
Because the Catan were defeated by the Great Old Ones.
Yes.
No. And the Necron. It's complicated.
Yeah. They were, the Catan enslaved the Necron tier, but at the same time were broken.
Yeah.
Basically.
They were tricked. It's a whole thing.
They were tricked. The same way that the Catan tricked the Necron tier into offering up their souls for these artificial bodies, they were also tricked by the Necron tier to take on physical form, so they diminished themselves, and they basically became shards.
Yeah.
That could be imprisoned and locked away.
And there's a lot of stuff in that is very, at least lower level Cthulhu mythos.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that is very close to it.
Well, yeah, that'll wrap it up for our deep dive into the Lovecraftian mythos and the Chaos Gods. As always, Chac and I will be back to explore more of the speculative fiction that inspired Warhammer 40k. I think we'll next probably actually deal with the old ones and the Slan as far from 40k goes. If you have any feedback or questions about this episode or the podcast in general, you can reach out to us at underthehiveofmadness@gmail.com. Chac, go ahead and run down where people can find you.
You can find me at Chac Balam on TikTok. You can find me at Chac Balam _ on Instagram, because that was taken. I also run a couple of sort of out there strange Facebook groups that deal with Legions Imperialis, the new sort of epic game coming out. And then I've got a small group that deals with 3D printing and alternate scale science fiction armies, although it's mostly 40, 30K stuff, but it's me and a couple of other people talking about everything from 15 millimeter down to 3 millimeter armies. Anything that's not 28 millimeter, because that's boring.
It's a pretty, I got to admit, it's pretty cool. I love jumping in and seeing what everybody's talking about.
Yeah,
I'm not at the level of investing in Epic, but
I've been, like I said, I did Epic back in the day, so I'm definitely doing it. I don't know if it'll last, but I also have so much of the classic stuff, and of course I can just print out as much as I want. So
yeah, that's always the nice part about
Nobody
it.
around here. I'm hopeful, because with the new game, maybe some people will actually play it. So I can actually play it with people, because nobody around me plays Epic. So
I'm seeing a lot of people that are kind of leaning towards doing stuff with it. So I imagine there's a chance that will be something that happens.
And then the other half of people think it's going to fail immediately. But I think it's going to stick around. It's been around with the, G-Dub kept Adeptus Titanicus, and they even kept AI, which is whatever airplanes Imperialis, even though they got rid of all the Xenos ones.
Yeah, which sucks, because those were the fun ones.
Yeah, but they're just converting it all to. They're just doing Horus Heresy.
It's all moving over. Yeah,
that's all there is. Even though there was plenty of Xenos in 30k, that's why my buddies, the Dark Angels, went from the largest chapter to one of the largest legion to one of the smallest ones.
It would be interesting to see Xenos. I think we mentioned this in a recent past episode. It'd be interesting to see Xenos in 30k, but I don't think it's ever.
There are a couple of people that are doing.
I think 30k is going to stay what it is.
Yeah, there are a couple of people that are doing a lot of kit bashing and a lot of development of Xenos of the Great Crusade, and so they've got HUD, they've got modeling. They're pulling everything out that they can so that you can actually play all the cool stuff that happened before those 9 years of the heresy.
Yeah, that would be what would be cool to me, is if they expand the heresy game to include the Great Crusade.
Yeah.
But if you guys want to get into contact with Chac or get into contact with us and continue any of these conversations, you can join us on our Discord community. Chac's there as well. We chat about Warhammer 40k lore, the hobby, and the tactics. Plus, we talk about Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, creative writing, video games, role-playing, a bunch of other stuff. You can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, or find us at www.underthehiveofmadness.com. Not only do I drop link trees, but I also have a bunch of spellings down in the description, so you can find all of us much easier. If you want to help the podcast grow, you can do that by liking and reviewing us wherever you get your podcast fix. Our home is Spotify, but you can also find us on Apple, Google, Audible, and several others, including iHeartRadio, Acast, a couple other places out there. You can also find us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/underthehiveofmadness. All Patreon members get access to a video podcast, so you can see our beautiful faces while hearing all of the blunders that happen. I don't edit that as much. You can also see whatever images that we bring up as we're talking about different stuff. Another thing that we've started doing for our Patreons, and Chac has actually already won. He was our first winner, as we started doing monthly giveaways. So if
I still think that was rigged. I won the first painting contest and the first giveaway.
But you won the objective markers for the giveaway. And when's the last time you played a sit-down game? Like a year ago?
I played one game in the last couple of months.
Okay.
My goal for 2024 is to play another game of 40k.
There you go. Take those objective markers with you. So we do giveaways. It's usually some of our own branded merch. The easiest way, the way to get into it right off the bat today is join and sub at either the $6 or $9 level. We're new to doing giveaways. We're new to figuring it all out. Like, do we give everybody who's at $6 2 chances? Do we give everybody who's at $9 3 chances? Like, we have to figure all that stuff out. So if you want to get involved immediately, that's the best way to do it. All of our Patreon levels also get access to our quarterly painting contest, which Chalk just mentioned. We set a theme. We give you guys like a month or two to paint the model, and then we do a vote. The community does a vote. The hosts, us, we do a vote, and then somebody wins a trophy. Chalk, you've got one.
Yep.
I'm surprised you haven't gone for a second one yet. We've won. Somebody's won a second Red Squig trophy. Somebody has two of them.
So much better. There weren't as many people involved, and now you got people that actually paint really good. And I'm just an okay painter.
You're a pretty good painter. You should do it again. Anyway, if you guys have any interest in seeing us grow as far as the channel goes and releasing different content and more types of content, head on over to Patreon and check all of that stuff out. We might be lost somewhere in the Rust Reef, harried by the echoing chants of some mad cult with the hounds of some eldritch monstrosity snapping at our heels, but at least I have these two nice new shiny plasma axes, and I would say this is a target-rich environment to test them in. Chalk, you always know how to find the good stuff, even if it's ichor covered this time. They can't stop the signal no matter how deep underground they force us, for we are the truthiness and the uncertain frosty cold the long night. 665.66 UHMR Chemrat Radio, reminding all of you Chemrats, Hive Mice, and Sump Ghoulies to keep those dials fixed right here. Same ratty frequency for a dose of the same ratty-ass attitude. In the Underhive's depths, where darkness does creep, 4 armed emperors with sinister secrets keep. With claws like daggers and eyes glowing red, stay close to the hearth, child, or you'll end up dead. They slink through tunnels, their plans obscure, stealing innocence with their icy grip, sealing fates for sure. So stay in your burrow, don't roam after dark, lest the 4-armed emperor leave their chilling mark. A children's limerick.
That was actually really good.
From the Hive. Thank you.
I don't have anything else to say about that. I like that.
I'm trying, man. All right, guys.
All right, see you all later.